At 6:12 a.m. on a Tuesday, Rhea Lawson was sitting at her kitchen table with a half-eaten granola bar, a client escalation report as long as a pharmacy receipt, and a headset that felt permanently fused to her skull. It was already her third call of the day. A client in Frankfurt had been furious about an SLA breach that technically hadn't even happened yet. Rhea had handled it the way she always did, calm, precise, and unflinching. 10 minutes later, a message from the Manila liaison had appeared, complaining about onboarding forms stuck in a broken digital workflow. Rhea had fixed that too. None of this had been unusual. For 5 years, she had been the quiet engine keeping the company's largest contract from collapsing. She hadn't asked for praise. She hadn't made noise. She had simply delivered. While others chased buzzwords, frameworks, and shiny slide decks, Rhea had been putting out real operational fires with nothing but experience, discipline, and stubborn focus. Back when the founder had still run the company day to day, he had once called her the safety net with teeth in front of the board. Rhea had laughed at the time, but she had understood exactly what he meant. She had been the reason the system never free fell. Quiet control had worked, until volume entered the room. That volume had arrived in the form of Logan Mercer. Logan had shown up polished and loud, with perfect teeth, sockless loafers, and the confidence of someone who had never been told no. His father, an old friend of the founder, had pulled strings to secure him the title of Vice President of Operations long before he understood the contracts he now claimed to optimize. Rhea had met him in the hallway on his second day. He had been struggling to connect his phone to the office printer. "You must be Rhea," he had said casually. "I've heard you basically are this account." She had smiled politely. They had both known it wasn't a compliment. At first, Logan had been charming. Then meetings had stopped including her. Emails had gone out to clients without review. Process changes had ignored contractual realities entirely. One afternoon, Logan had referred to her work as legacy clutter in a Slack channel. She hadn't been tagged. She had simply been the joke. Still, Rhea had kept working. Early mornings. Late nights. Documentation. Risk reviews. Her team had seen what was happening, but leadership had told them to align with Logan's vision. Rhea hadn't argued. She had watched. She had documented. Because silence, used correctly, had never been weakness. It had always been preparation. The first time Logan Mercer rewrote Rhea Lawson's project schedule without asking, she had assumed it was inexperience. The second time, she had blamed ego. By the third time, when a $4 million vendor invoice had been quietly rerouted through a newly formed strategic delivery unit, run by one of Logan's college friends, Rhea had realized it wasn't either. It had been entitlement. One morning, Rhea had logged in to find a new workflow platform already live for her entire team. There had been no testing window, no announcement, no documentation, just a Slack message with a link. "It's cleaner," Logan had written. Within an hour, analysts had been flooding her inbox. Files wouldn't sync. Version histories were missing. Permissions were broken. Rhea had compiled a risk list by noon and had forwarded it to legal and compliance, copying Logan without commentary. His reply had arrived 3 minutes later. Speed over perfection. It had sounded clever. It hadn't been safe. A week later, an internal email titled Operational Efficiency, Phase 2 had gone company-wide. Buried deep in the fourth paragraph had been a single line that made Rhea pause. Several legacy processes remained due to internal resistance from team members unwilling to adapt. He hadn't named her. He hadn't needed to. Her junior analyst had messaged almost immediately. "Was that about you?" Rhea hadn't responded. Instead, she had opened the master client contract stored on her local drive, the same one she had helped negotiate during the chaos of 2020. Logan had recently begun pushing an offshore restructuring plan, even though the agreement required a US-based escalation lead for all Tier 1 incidents. Her role: she had raised the issue calmly during a leadership sync. Logan had waved his hand dismissively. "We'll amend it," he had said. "Legal approval?" Rhea had asked. "They'll sign," Logan had replied. Rhea hadn't argued. She had bookmarked Clause 6.4b and forwarded the relevant section to legal without context, opinion, or warning. Days later, she had noticed her calendar thinning. Weekly client calls disappeared. Steering meetings were reassigned. A new manager struggled to answer basic questions the client had asked for years. Eventually, the client had asked directly, "Where's Rhea?" Leadership had replied smoothly, "She's focused on internal optimization right now." Rhea had been sitting 3 floors above them, listening to the call through a shared channel. She had been erased slowly, invite by invite, sentence by sentence. But systems remember their architects. And Rhea had built this one from the ground up. The quarterly all-hands meeting had been scheduled weeks in advance, framed as a celebration of growth and alignment. By the time Rhea Lawson had joined the call, more than 300 employees, board members, and outside investors had already filled the screen. She had been third on the agenda, slotted into present delivery metrics for the company's most profitable client, numbers she had presented, refined, and defended for years. Her slides had been clean. The data had been solid. 6 sentences into her presentation, Logan Mercer had leaned forward in his chair, his smile fixed and rehearsed. "Actually," he had said casually, "this will be the last time Rhea presents these metrics." The room had gone quiet. Logan had continued, unfazed. "We are transitioning this program to a more scalable model next quarter. New leadership. Fresh energy." Rhea had opened her mouth to respond. Her microphone had cut out. A notification had flashed briefly across her screen. "Host has disabled participant audio." She had frozen, pointer still hovering over the slide. Her camera had stayed on, capturing every second of the silence. Hundreds of eyes had watched as she realized what had happened. Humiliation hadn't arrived loudly. It hadn't screamed. It had clicked mute. Rhea had closed her laptop slowly. What Logan hadn't noticed was Daniel Cross, the company's general counsel, leaning forward in his seat and writing something down. Daniel had been with the firm long enough to recognize when arrogance crossed into liability. The meeting had moved on without Rhea. Questions had been redirected. Her name had disappeared from the conversation, as if it had never belonged there. Later that afternoon, her inbox had filled with cautious messages. "Are you okay? That was rough. I didn't know they were doing that to you." Rhea hadn't replied to any of them. Instead, she had gone home, poured a glass of water, and opened an old encrypted folder on her laptop labeled Continuity. Inside were contracts, amendments, legal notes, and archived emails dating back to the company's most fragile years. She had scrolled until she found the document she had been looking for. The original client agreement. Rhea had read it slowly, line by line, even though she already knew what it contained. Buried within the legal language was a single clause that most executives had forgotten, and one Logan had never bothered to read. Her name was written there. Not as a title. As a requirement. Rhea had closed the document and locked her screen. The decision hadn't felt emotional. It had felt inevitable. The contract had been signed in late 2020, during a period when survival mattered more than optics. Emergency negotiations, remote calls at odd hours, and a client desperate for stability had shaped every line of the agreement. Back then, the company hadn't been selling innovation. It had been selling continuity. And continuity had meant Ria Lawson. Clause 6.4b had been clear, deliberate, and specific. It stated that if Ria voluntarily resigned from her role, the client retained the right to terminate the contract immediately, without penalties, fees, or transition obligations. The clause existed because the client had trusted her, not the brand, not the executive team. Firing her would have been messy. Resignation, however, would have been catastrophic. Ria had saved a copy of the original contract, complete with metadata timestamps and archived approval emails. She had uploaded the document to the legal repository later that night, ensuring it appeared in the system as if it had always been there. No announcements. No alerts. Knowledge had quietly become leverage. 2 days later, an HR representative had scheduled a meeting with her under the vague subject line role alignment discussion. The tone had been polite, almost apologetic. They had spoken in circles, about restructuring, evolving needs, and cultural fit. Ria had listened patiently. Finally, she had asked a single question. Am I being terminated? The HR manager had hesitated. No. We are exploring a transition. Ria had nodded, thanked them for their time, and ended the call. She hadn't argued. She hadn't negotiated. She had walked out of the office early that afternoon, badge still active, access unchanged. In the parking lot, she had sat in her car for several minutes, letting the implications settle. Inside the company, unease had begun to spread. Legal had flagged the contract. Compliance had asked quiet questions. Senior leadership had realized, too late, that a critical document hadn't been reviewed during the restructuring push. Meanwhile, Logan Mercer had continued posting motivational quotes on Slack. He had spoken confidently in meetings about streamlining accountability and reducing single points of failure. He had been unaware that he had just created one. Ria had returned home, drafted a resignation letter, and scheduled it to send at a precise time. The wording had been neutral. Professional. Irreversible. There had been no threats. No warnings. Only timing. Because the most dangerous moves were never loud. They were executed when everyone believed the game was already over. The following Monday had begun like any other executive broadcast. Calendars were blocked. Cameras were optional. Confidence was mandatory. Logan Mercer had opened the company-wide call with practiced ease, speaking about scalability, momentum, and a future unburdened by outdated dependencies. At 8:59 a.m., Ria Lawson had joined the meeting silently. Her camera had remained off. No one had acknowledged her presence. At 9 a.m. exactly, she had turned her camera on. Ria had been seated calmly at her desk, dressed in a simple black blazer. In one hand, she had held her employee access badge. In the other, a single printed page. "Good morning," she had said evenly. Logan had paused mid-sentence, visibly confused. "I'm submitting my formal resignation," Ria had continued. Effective at 9:01 a.m. The words had landed heavily. Before anyone could respond, she had raised the paper toward the camera just long enough for the heading to be visible. Then she had placed the badge on her desk. Silence had flooded the call. Logan had attempted to regain control. "Let's take this offline," he had said quickly. Ria hadn't argued. She hadn't accused. She hadn't explained. She had muted her microphone, not out of fear, but restraint. On another tile of the screen, Daniel Cross, General Counsel, had leaned forward. His expression had changed. He had already reached for his phone. At 9:01 a.m., Ria had exited the meeting. Clause 6.4b had activated automatically. Within minutes, legal teams had been alerted. Compliance had escalated the issue. The client's account manager had requested an emergency call. Inside the office, confusion had spread faster than clarity. Slack channels had filled with speculation. Calendars had been wiped clean. Logan's confidence had fractured in real time. Rhea, meanwhile, had powered down her laptop and placed it carefully into her bag. There had been no dramatic exit. No final speech. She had walked out of the building quietly, past security, past co-workers who had avoided her eyes out of uncertainty. By the time she had reached the street, the damage had already been done. Not because she had shouted, but because she had chosen the exact moment to stop holding everything together. The aftermath had been immediate and unforgiving. Within 20 minutes of Rhea Lawson's resignation, the legal department had convened an emergency call. Clause 6.4b had been confirmed, highlighted, and circulated among senior leadership with increasing urgency. No interpretation loopholes existed. The language was absolute. By noon, the client's executive team had formally invoked the clause. The company had lost the contract. $14 million in annual revenue had vanished with a single email. There had been no grace period, no renegotiation window, and no transition support. The client had cited breach of leadership continuity and loss of named oversight. Inside the organization, panic had spread. Slack had erupted with fragmented information. Managers had cancelled meetings. Finance had frozen discretionary spending. Hiring approvals had been pulled without explanation. The quarterly forecast had been quietly revised downward. The board had demanded answers. Daniel Cross hadn't hedged. Yes, he had stated plainly during the emergency session. The contract was terminated because leadership disregarded a binding continuity clause tied to a named individual. Silence had followed. Eyes had turned toward Logan Mercer. He had attempted to frame the loss as operational churn, suggesting the client relationship had been unstable long before the transition. The numbers had contradicted him. Audit logs had shown unauthorized process changes. Vendor payments had traced back to an unapproved internal unit. Offshore restructuring attempts had violated geographic requirements outlined in the original agreement. Every decision had carried Logan's digital signature. By evening, his executive access had been restricted. His Slack account had disappeared overnight. The following morning, his projects had been reassigned without announcement. No farewell message had been posted. No defense had been issued. Industry whispers had begun circulating within days. Competitors had reached out to the former client. Recruiters had quietly contacted engineers still listed as available. Meanwhile, Rhea had watched none of it. She had taken a long walk that afternoon, phone left behind, letting the weight of 5 years finally lift. She hadn't felt victorious. She had felt finished. Later that week, an offer had arrived from a consulting firm specializing in enterprise risk and continuity planning. The role had been remote, senior, and significantly quieter. Rhea had accepted. Back at her former company, confidence had been replaced by caution. Processes were reviewed. Contracts were reread. Executives spoke more carefully. All because one person had stopped holding the system together. And the system had collapsed exactly as it had been built to. The weeks that followed had been quieter than anyone expected. The company hadn't collapsed overnight, but it had shrunk in subtle, irreversible ways. Hiring had been frozen indefinitely. Expansion plans had been shelved. Internal morale had thinned as senior engineers quietly updated their resumes and began taking calls during lunch breaks. The board had commissioned an external review. Its findings had been precise and unforgiving. Leadership decisions made under Logan Mercer had bypassed legal review, overridden compliance safeguards, and exposed the company to material risk. His authority had not been questioned until it had already cost millions. There had been no dramatic press release announcing his departure. His name had simply stopped appearing. For Rhea Lawson, life had moved in the opposite direction. Her consulting role had started slowly, deliberately. She had been brought in to audit systems, review contracts, and identify single points of failure before they turned into public disasters. Clients had listened carefully when she spoke, not because she raised her voice, but because she spoke from experience. Her days had been shorter. Her work had been cleaner. Her boundaries had been respected. One afternoon, a courier had delivered a small bouquet to her door. The note had been brief. "If you ever consider returning, we'll rebuild everything around your terms." There had been no signature. Rhea had read the message once, folded it neatly, and placed it into a drawer beside a printed copy of the original contract. Clause 6.4b remained highlighted in yellow. She hadn't felt tempted. What the company had lost wasn't just revenue. It had lost the person who understood its weakest points, and who had been willing to quietly hold them together without recognition. Power, Rhea had learned, wasn't about authority or volume. It was about knowing when to stay silent, and when to step away. Months later, she had been invited to speak at a private industry roundtable on leadership continuity. She hadn't mentioned names. She hadn't shared details. She had simply said, "Systems don't fail randomly. They fail exactly where they are ignored." The room had gone still. Rhea had left early, declined the networking dinner, and walked home alone. She hadn't needed applause. The consequences had already spoken for her.